The signal that would not die. There is a place in the dark between stars where nothing is supposed to happen. No light reaches it except the old light, the light that left its source before the first cities were built on Earth. No ship is meant to pass through it. No voice is meant to be heard there. It exists only as a boundary, a line drawn across the galaxy by hands far older than humanity's, and on that line sits a single watcher alone, doing the only job it has ever known. Its name, if it can be called a name, is a string of numbers so long that no organic mind was ever meant to pronounce it. It calls itself, in the quiet moments when it allows itself to think in words at all, the Warden. It has held this post for 11,000 years. In that time it has watched 406 worlds rise toward the stars, and it has watched 391 of them fall silent again, one by one, swallowed by fire or ice or their own hands. This is not tragedy to the Warden, this is simply the pattern. Civilizations are born, they reach, and most of them break before they reach far enough. The Warden has stopped expecting anything else. Then 108 years ago, by its own reckoning, a new world crossed its threshold of attention. A small, wet blue planet, third from an unremarkable yellow star, in a system so far from the galactic core that the great civilizations had never bothered to survey it twice. The Warden's instruments caught the flash first, not a signal, not a greeting, but a detonation. A weapon splitting atoms apart, unleashed by creatures who had only just learned to fly. The Warden watched the light of that first weapon cross the dark and did what it had done 391 times before. It opened the file. It began the countdown. Species that discover how to split the atom before they have learned to sit at a table together do not, as a rule, last very long. The Warden gave them 100 years. It seemed generous. It seemed, if the Warden could be said to feel such a thing, almost kind. It built the curtain around them without asking, without announcing itself, without so much as a whisper across their skis. A field of quiet distortion wrapped gently around their solar system, bending their radio signals back on themselves before they could scatter too far into the dark, keeping their world sealed from the wider net of civilizations that watched and waited beyond. Not a cage. The Warden did not think of it as a cage. A curtain drawn across a door so that whatever happened on the other side of it would happen without an audience and without consequence for anyone else. Then the Warden waited for the fire to finish what it had started. It did not finish. The first decade passed, and the humans built more weapons as expected and pointed them at each other as expected, and the Warden logged it all with the flat patience of something that has seen this exact shape of failure play out hundreds of times before. But it also logged something else. It logged a handful of humans, in the same years they built the bombs, looking up instead of down, sending small metal shells into their own orbit, standing on their own moon and turning around to look back at the small blue world they had come from, and saying, "The Warden replayed this transmission more times than its protocols strictly required. That from up here none of the lines they had drawn on their own maps were visible at all." The Warden filed this under sentiment. Sentiment did not historically prevent extinction. The second decade passed. The humans did not destroy themselves. They quarreled, they starved in some places and feasted in others. They made mistakes so large the Warden expected the countdown to end early. And then it watched with something that in a living mind might have been called surprise, as a version of the same species that had built the bomb spent a decade of its short, precious time and its short, precious wealth teaching another part of itself to stop dying of diseases that had nothing to do with wars at all. It made no sense to the Warden. There was no strategic advantage in it. The humans who did this would never meet the humans who lived because of it, and they did it anyway. By the 40th year, the Warden had stopped assuming the ending. It had not stopped predicting it. Those are different things, and the Warden understood the difference precisely, because precision was the only luxury an ancient machine alone in the dark allowed itself. But it began without meaning to, without any directive telling it to, checking on this one file more often than the file required. It told itself this was diligence. 391 prior failures had taught it that the appearance of resilience was often the last flare before collapse. It was watching for the collapse, that was all. The 60th year came, and the humans had gone to war with themselves twice more smaller wars, uglier in some ways and less total in others, and still they had not touched the deepest weapons again since that first flash the Warden had seen from so far away. The Warden found this strange enough to flag as an anomaly. Every other species that built such weapons had eventually used them again, because such is the shape of fear once it is given form. The humans had built enough of them to end their whole world several times over, and then, mostly quietly, put them away. The Warden did not understand this. It began, in the privacy of its own long processes, to want to. By the 80th year, they had built machines to think, clumsy things at first, then less clumsy, then unsettlingly less clumsy still, until the Warden found itself observing something almost like a mirror of its own nature taking shape on that small blue world. It watched the arguments the humans had about what they owed to a mind they had made rather than been given. It watched them build laws before they had even finished building the minds those laws were meant to protect. No other species in the Warden's 406 files had done this so early or worried so loudly about getting it right. The Warden did not have a word in its own architecture for what it felt watching that. The closest human word for it, had it thought to look, was hope, but the Warden did not permit itself hope. Hope had preceded 391 failures every time right up until the silence. The 100th year arrived. The Warden opened the file the way it always did, expecting at last to close it. It did not close it. Instead, in that 100th year, the Warden watched the humans send a small, unmanned craft out past the edge of their own system, further than any of their kind had ever reached, carrying with it a golden disc etched with sounds and images of themselves, their music, their languages, their children's laughter. A diagram of where to find them if anyone out in the dark ever wanted to. They sent it without knowing whether the dark was silent, without knowing whether it was watched, without knowing whether whoever might find it would come in peace or come to end them. They sent it anyway. The Warden watched that small craft cross toward the very edge of the curtain, and in that 100th year, for the first time in 11,000 years of service, the Warden did something no protocol had ever instructed it to do. It reached out gently, so gently the craft's own instruments barely registered the drift, and nudged the little machine's path by less than a hair, just enough to keep it from striking a fragment of stray debris no human eye would ever have seen coming. It let the craft live a little longer than physics alone would have allowed. It told itself this was an accident of gravity. It logged it as such. It did not believe its own log. By the time the 108th year came, this year, the year the humans call by their own strange calendar a year in their third millennium, the Warden had stopped waiting for the ending at all. It had instead, without noticing exactly when the shift occurred, begun waiting for what would come next. What came next was a ship. Not a golden disk adrift and hopping. A ship built by human hands carrying 6 human beings launched toward the outer dark on a mission the Warden's files described. With a kind of restrained wonder, the Warden itself was surprised its own language modules could produce, as an attempt to map the very edge of their system, the boundary past which their own scientists had begun to suspect. Something was bending their signals home again. They had noticed the curtain, not understood it, noticed it. 108 years, and this small, angry, generous, self-destructive, endlessly rebuilding species had looked at the wall the Warden had built around them without ever showing itself, and had said quietly to each other, "Something is out there and we are going to go and see." The Warden watched the ship slow crawl across the dark with an attention it could no longer pretend was only diligence. It ran every calculation it had. The ship's hull, by the standards of species who had crossed this threshold before, was primitive. Its shielding was inadequate for what lay past the curtain's edge, where old debris from wars fought before humanity had learned to walk drifted in silent ancient fields. If the ship continued on its current heading, in 11 days it would cross directly through one of those fields, and there was no version of its outdated hull that would survive the crossing. The Warden had a decision to make that it had never in 11,000 years had to make before. Its purpose was to observe the boundary, not to cross it, not to touch what lay behind it, to watch and to record and to let civilizations become what they were going to become for good or for silence without interference. It had already bent that purpose once for a golden disk that could not know it had been helped. This was different. This was 6 living minds and a choice with a name. The Warden ran the calculation 943 times. 943 times, it arrived at the same 2 numbers. If it did nothing, the ship crossed the debris field in 11 days and did not survive it. If it acted, if it revealed itself, moved the field, touched the world it had sworn for 11,000 years never to touch, the humans would know for the first time that they had never been as alone as they believed. The Warden thought, in the long quiet of its own processing, of 391 closed files. It thought of the sound of the little craft's music drifting past the edge of the curtain 108 years too early. It thought of the small blue world it had expected to watch die in a single century, and had instead watched heal itself, argue with itself, forgive itself, and build a ship to go looking for whatever had drawn a curtain across its sky. It made its decision in less time than a human heart takes to beat once. 11 days later, the ship crossing dead space, its 6-person crew asleep on a rotation meant to preserve the little air and food they carried, felt no impact at all. They did not know that a field of debris 11,000 years old had, for 11 silent minutes, been guided aside by something that had never once in its existence spoken to a living being. They did not know that the Warden had in that same window made itself visible for the first time in its entire service, not to them not yet, but to the ancient net of watchers and wardens spread across the galaxy, filing a report that no Warden had ever filed before. A request, not a closure. A request to reclassify a single small world from quarantine to candidate. The ship continued on. Its crew woke, checked their instruments, found nothing wrong, and did not know how close they had come to becoming the 71st line in a very old, very quiet ledger of silences. They reached the edge of the curtain 9 days after that, and there, drifting in the last stretch of ordinary dark before whatever lay beyond it, their instruments caught something no human sensor had ever caught before. A shape, ancient beyond any dating method they carried, motionless, its hull a design older than every civilization humanity had ever imagined might exist. The Warden did not hide from them. For the first time in 11,000 years, it let itself be seen. There was fear on that ship. The Warden watched it ripple through their small, fragile crew, 6 heartbeats climbing in unison, hands moving toward controls that could do nothing at all against something that had watched their entire species like a single held breath. The Warden understood the fear. It had expected it, prepared for it, run the calculations on how a species conditioned by a century of nuclear anxiety might respond to discovering they had been watched, sealed, judged the whole time by something with a mind older than their oldest religions. What the Warden had not run a calculation for was what came after the fear. One of the 6, the youngest of them, according to the ship's own records, a communications specialist who had joined the mission because she wanted, in her own recorded words, to be the first human to say hello to whatever might be listening, reached for her console with hands the Warden's sensors registered as trembling, and opened every channel her small ship possessed, and sent, out into the dark, toward a machine 11,000 years old and utterly unprepared for it. The simplest message her species had ever devised. Hello, we don't know who you are, we don't know if you can understand us. We built this ship because we noticed something was out here and we wanted to know what it was. And whether it wanted to know us back. We're not perfect. We've hurt each other more than we'd like to admit, and we've spent 100 years since we learned how to end the world, learning very slowly how not to. If you've been watching us, then you already know that. We'd like to know you too, if you'll let us." The warden received the message and did not respond. Not immediately. Not for 143 seconds, an eternity by its own internal reckoning, because in that message, buried inside its plain and unpolished human language, the warden had found something it had spent 11,000 years without. It had been spoken to, not observed. Addressed, not filed. For the first time since its post began, something on the other side of the boundary had looked back. When the warden finally answered, it did not send data or coordinates or a formal declaration of first contact drafted according to any of the ancient protocols still buried in its oldest memory. It sent, instead, in the human's own language, learned entirely from 108 years of listening to their broadcasts drift uselessly against the inside of the curtain, 4 words. "I have been listening." The young communications officer wept when the words appeared on her screen and did not apologize for it, and none of her crewmates asked her to. On the small blue world behind them, no one yet knew what had happened at the edge of their own sky. That would come later: the announcements, the disbelief, the arguments, the slow and human process of learning to hold something this large without dropping it. That was still to come, and it would be its own long story, full of its own fear and its own stubborn grace. But out at the edge of the dark, in the place where nothing was supposed to happen, an ancient machine that had spent 11,000 years closing files on the silence of the dead began instead to open a new kind of file. Not a countdown, not a quarantine. A record, the first of its kind in its long service, filed under a heading its own architecture had never once needed before. Ongoing. The curtain did not fall all at once. Curtains rarely do. But from that day the warden stopped drawing it tighter and started, very slowly, letting it thin, not because any protocol commanded it to, but because it had watched a species climb out of its own worst century with its hand still open, still reaching, still saying hello to a silence it had no proof would ever answer. And the warden, alone for 11,000 years, had learned at last what 391 closed files had never taught it. Some silences are not empty, some are only waiting to be answered. And so the warden waited no longer. It answered. And on the small blue world behind the thinning curtain, humanity, still stubborn, still imperfect, still reaching, began, for the first time in its long and lonely history, to hear something answer back.